Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development CropTalk webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation today, please type them into the question section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. I'd like to welcome everybody to the September 30th edition of CropTalk. Getting definitely closer to fall out there, and we're definitely seeing some weather changes. And as that happens, we are getting closer and closer to being done harvest, and soil sampling has been going on. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity to get John Hurt to come on today and help us in understanding our soil test report, go through some of the lines of the soil test report and kind of tell us what they mean and what we need to do as we're reading those reports. After that, we'll go into our crop scouting panel, and we've got a few questions for today for them to answer as well. So with that, I'll start off again with a little bit of a quick update. As you can see by the picture I took here, harvest is definitely coming closer to an end as a lot of producers are finishing up their last fields, and you can see that by our new update from the crop report. When we look at our position, we got spring wheat and most of our cereals were anywhere from 95 to 98% complete. So, those ones are pretty much on their last fields. Maybe some late seeded crops that I did talk to a couple producers that had some issues with canola that landed up seeding them to crops like oats and stuff like that. So they're a little bit later coming in right now, and so those are the crops that are probably out there right now, crops that producers had some issues with and just had to get them in a little bit later. We took a big jump in our canola harvest this past week from last week, and we can see now we're at 85% complete, and I've seen even some of the light showers we had in the last couple of days. Producers are still out there. I think the rains haven't been enough to wet the seed as much as just wetting the straw down, and so whenever they get back out there, they're going to be out there, and I would imagine they're going to be going out there today. The forecast isn't great, so as soon as they can get back on the field today, they'll be out there. Flax harvest has jumped as well, or 51%. Again, it's one of the crops that straw is the biggest issue when getting into that crop. And I've talked to a couple producers that say the seed is real close, but the straw is still grass green. So it's going to be a little bit of a challenge getting the flax crop in as well. Again, in the soybeans, when you look at them, we've taken a jump as well. I think more the eastern side of the province than the western side here, but I did see some harvest going on in the southwest corners of the western side of the province here. Most of the crop that is being harvested right now in soybeans is stuff that was planted early, so really haven't seen any issues so far for quality-wise from any of the frost we've had over the past 2 to 3 weeks here. So those crops are still going to be coming in, so we really don't have a firm understanding, I guess, as to how or if that frost has damaged the soybean crop that was sown a little bit later. When you look at sunflowers and grain corn, again, crops that still haven't started to be harvested yet, and the percentage is low. A lot of corn silage over the past week has been done, and you see a lot of those fields being cleaned up. Conditions this year for taking off corn silage has been pretty much perfect for a lot of producers. That frost we had a couple weeks ago started to dry the crop down, and we don't have a lot of wet fields to be worried about this year. Our moisture levels, our soil moisture levels are anywhere from I guess when you look at the maps, they're anywhere from optimal to below or dry conditions. So again, traveling on those fields has made it a lot easier to get the silage in the pit a lot faster this year. When you look at our overall harvest completion, we're sitting at around 80%, which is above our 3-year average at about 73%. So weather conditions definitely made for better harvest for producers this fall so far anyways. When you look at what's happening next, and we're starting to see fall work starting, and over the next few days, we're going to be seeing some fall fertilizing starting already. You see anhydrous tanks being moved to producers' yards now, and I thought I'd put this link on. This is a link to our weather stations, and if you wanted to go to this link, it gives you a summary of weather over the last 24 hours. And mainly because last week when we did the webinar and we're talking about fall fertilizing, John Hurd was on one of the questions that was brought up to the panel. And John Hurd was talking about soil temperatures and when it was the best time to start applying fertilizer. So I thought that would be a good link for producers to go to and see what soil temperatures are doing. So we're not risking losing some of that nitrogen we're putting on in the fall here. So I guess a good link to go to. So with the fall fertilizing, we're definitely looking at producers doing soil sampling, and that's why I thought it'd be great to get John on today to go through the soil test results and help us better understand them so we can make better management decisions as we go forward here. So with that, Laurie, I think we'll turn it over to John and get him to do his presentation.
Okay, are we live there? Laurie, you've got my right screen up?
You bet.
Okay, well, I guess it's a good thing I don't see the audience today, because with a title like this is sometimes what happens to the group. But really, when folks get their soil test values back, it should be kind of like Christmas, time to open up. And you don't need to have the fear like it's a COVID test, or the euphoria like it's a pregnancy test, but I'd expect something in between, because soil testing helps determine fertilizer rates, and Manitoba farmers every year spend between $600 to $700 million on fertilizer. So we don't expect people to just snooze through this or through their test when they see it. So I'm having trouble queuing down.
Try the arrow to the right on your keyboard.
There. Okay, thanks, Dave. There's been surveys done and looked at how is it that prairie farmers decide how they're going to put on rates of fertilizer. And this study done by Stratus basically shows that, of some 400 to plus farmers across the prairies, that they base a lot of their rates on past experience. And second most commonly used factor, of course, is soil testing, used by about 50% of farmers for their nitrogen and phosphorus rates. Other factors, of course, are yield-based rates, and that would be based on anticipating what my yields might be and how much nutrients I'll need. So soil testing ranks right up there as far as a decision criteria. And if we look at how are we doing in Manitoba, these respondents in the survey from Manitoba, in these years, 2015 to 2017, shows that about 33 to 46% of our farmers soil test for nitrogen every year. We don't ask a good question. We don't ask them, is that every field or is that just some fields every year? But it does show there's a measure of soil sampling going on, and that's generally quite a bit higher than Saskatchewan, a bit higher than Alberta. And if we look at the other nutrients, phosphorus and potassium and others, we can see that within every 3 years, about 60% of the growers are testing. Only 20% of the farmers surveyed here rarely or never soil test for those nutrients. So soil testing certainly is commonly done on farms and the prairies. Now, there's a number of labs that people send their test reports to. I've listed 4 here. There's A&L labs here. So A&L is located in London, Ontario. AgVise does their testing in North Dakota. Farmers Edge does their testing in Winnipeg. And they all use the traditional wet chemistry that we kind of have based a lot of our recommendations on. A newer approach, but it's been around for some 20 years now, is the use of the plant root simulators by Western Ag Labs. They have their own recommendation system, and it's proprietary, and I really have no opinion on that. I'm not, I don't have the inside track, whereas these other labs that do the wet chemistry, traditional chemistry, we have second opinions we can offer on those based on the provincial soil testing lab. So I'll be focusing on their results and interpreting those reports. And on the soil test report, once you've got the report, you have to assume that the proper job was done sampling the field, proper depths, proper timing, avoiding poor areas. So we're going to assume that we've sampled the field adequately. And I look at the soil test report, and there's actually 3 areas on there. One that looks at soil properties, or I would say helps identify what might be yield limiting factors. The second would be the soil nutrient levels. The third area would be the fertilizer recommendations, which I'm not going to really talk about today, just the report. And Lionel kind of tasked me with kind of highlighting what those values mean and what might be reasonable target values to look for on your soil test report. So those soil properties that directly affect productivity, example yield, are organic matter, pH, salinity, and cation exchange capacity. And as I go through this, I kind of show a little gauge here. You know, you might mark in here, say, what was your actual level? But then it's often nice to know what's a desired or an optimal range that you would have that field in. And that desired range can change, or your values will change based on management on the farm. There can be changes in management. There can also be year-to-year variability that we need to recognize. They will affect soil test values. But even the desired range can change based on whether this is rented land versus owned land, or whether crop prices are high or fertilizer costs are high. That we can temper those desired ranges and fertilization strategies. So to look first at organic matter, it's important as a yardstick of general productivity. It can affect the mineralization potential, or certainly the quantity of nitrogen and sulfur that's in the soil and might be available for uptake that year. Some labs actually estimate how much nitrogen will be released based on the organic matter. We call it estimated nitrogen release. Organic matter is important for water holding capacity, which can build yield potential. It's important for soil structure and water infiltration. It's a component of cation exchange capacity that I'll cover later, and even factors into herbicide rates. High organic matter levels require some higher rates with some of the soil applied fertilizers. Now, one of the places that people often like to use organic matter, mentioned earlier, is how does it relate to nitrogen release? And we've had a number of studies in recent years. This is from wheat studies and others with corn. And we find this relationship between organic matter and nitrogen release. No relationship. Despite our best hunch, we know that there as organic matter goes up, there's a greater reserve, but that doesn't necessarily mean that reserve is going to kick out. Mother Nature, moisture and warmth are what allow mineralization to take place, and the soil test just can't predict that in advance. So it hasn't worked out well for us where it's been evaluated. And to kick this can, there's a lot of soil health tests out there these days being promoted. One is the Sovita carbon dioxide burst test, and really it not only had a poor relationship, it had a worse than poor, it had a erroneous or misleading relationship with nitrogen mineralization. So some of these tests are just not dialed in for prairie conditions. Another one. Marla, are you on the line?
Yes, I am, John.
Here you are. Take it away. Salinity is your baby.
Oh, well, thank you. So John's got this slide in here talking about salinity because that is definitely something you want to be watching on your soil test, especially if you are attempting to grow crops like corn or soybeans that typically are a bit more salt sensitive. And so looking at your salinity test is going to give you more of a general idea of that productivity. And again, the salinity, salts, soluble salts, electrical conductivity, however it's listed on whichever lab test you're looking for, is more of an indirect measurement of that actual concentration of salts that are in the soil, but it will give you an indication of how that concentration of salt is going to affect potential crops. Quite often we understand that this is probably a drainage related issue potentially, where you have poorly drained soils or upward water movement from a higher water table, and that capillary rise drawing salts up. So it does give you an indication potentially of something related to drainage. And often in saline areas, you may find that there are also other high nutrient levels just because the crop isn't growing very well there. So years of application of nitrogen, phosphorus can be built up over time because the crop isn't utilizing them. And then the sulfur test, where the salts are high, that's naturally high sulfur because sulfate is typically one of those salts that shows up. So on John's little graph here, he has, anything below 1 is really what you're looking for if you're trying to grow something like soybeans and corn, but for other crops, you want to be below 2.
Okay. I'm going to advance that slide for you, Marla, as soon as my cursor comes back to life.
He's got to hover down over top of the bottom. Yeah, there you go. So as mentioned, the salinity threshold is going to be very low when it comes to crops like soybeans and corn. So that blue and red line on the graph. And you can see that very quickly at that on the yellow bar at the bottom, once you hit 1 or 2, those crops start to drop off. And by the time you get up to something around where that red arrow is, you've got nothing left for yield when it comes to soybeans and corn. Whereas our crops like wheat, barley, canola included, they have a lot longer threshold before they actually start to be affected by salinity. So you see that starting around the number 4. There is an important note though, when I'm pointing out that we're looking at the yellow bar on the bottom, that is the number that is usually done by your test, which is a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 soil to water test. It's a cheap test. It's an easy test. That's why it gets done at the lab for any fields that we're running, because it's quite fast to do and it doesn't cost a whole lot. The number on the bottom of the graph that's approximately double, so where it says 0.2468 going up, that is a specialized test that is done for research purposes. And the relationship, like you can see, is it's approximately twice as high as that 1-to-1 test that you would be getting done at the lab for a general commercial soil test. The reason why, again, there is a difference in this, or why they would do that different test, is it gets just a slightly more accurate reflection of the true concentration of salts in the root zone that the plant is affected by. But really, you just need to know that you need to do that general factoring. So if you see anything on threshold levels that are coming out of research, recognize that those are probably using a saturated paste test, and that's not the same number that you would see on your general one-to-one test. So you need to take those saturated paste test numbers and divide them by 1 to compare them to your soil test.
Okay.
In terms of what salts we end up seeing, so quite commonly we see calcium sulfates or gypsum-based salts. And this is why sulfate ends up being so extremely high in saline areas. We don't soil test the saline spots, specifically because they will throw your general test out of whack for sulfur. So we always stay out of those areas. That being said, when we stay out of those areas, we're actually not accurately reflecting how bad the salinity is, because we're not actually testing those high saline spots. So we see a lot of calcium sulfate, sometimes calcium chlorides, magnesium sulfates will show up as well. So we often will see, again, either sulfur or chloride as high. In terms of sodium salts, it's very uncommon in Manitoba to have sodium affected soils. Sodium itself, this is a completely different issue outside of just a salinity issue. If you have high sodium, that becomes a structural issue that might not be a salinity problem, even though it has sodium as being high. In that case, if you think that you have a sodium-based problem, so that would be a soil structural-based problem, first you want to give John or I a call to discuss it. But in that case, if you have a problem, you want to actually know how bad it is, then you need to get a specialized test done called the sodium adsorption ratio or SAR. And in that case, if the SAR is above 13, then you know that you have a soil that is heavily affected by sodium, which is affecting that soil structure. But again, that is a more specialized test and not something that you can quickly calculate off of a general soil test.
Good. Thanks, Marla.
No problem.
Okay. Next, I look at the soil pH. You can look at the pH to see it's a measure of general productivity. Where it severely affects productivity is if we have acidic soils, less than 5.5, which is not common in Manitoba, but we have a few areas, the Keld soils, we have some of the sands over the Assiniboine Aquifer that are becoming acidic. They can affect crops. At those levels, we can have manganese and aluminum toxicity in crops, so that's why we need to lime. Similarly, rhizobium performance is reduced on acidic soils, but again, not a widespread issue in Manitoba. Where pH does affect other things, though, is it can cause us to be more smarter in our phosphorus placement, to do soil testing for micronutrients because some of them tend to be less soluble at high pH. It's important for herbicide decomposition. The sulfonylureas and the triazines stick around for a long time at high pH. At low pH, the pursuit odyssey types are more persistent. And at high pH, we have more seed-placed fertilizer toxicity or risk of volatilization risk. We just end up with more free ammonia. So high pH will indicate that to us. And as Marla mentioned earlier about sodium, if we see our pH very high, greater than 8.5, it may be signaling to us that sodium may be an issue. So we've all seen this chart, which the broader the bar, the greater the availability of the nutrients. And where would be the sweet spot if you were able to choose the desired pH? It would be in this area, 6.5 to the low 7s. The purpose for that is that phosphorus tends to be most available in that range. Note, it's very less available as we get acidic soils. And the other thing is that some of the micronutrients, copper and zinc, become available in that range, where above that their solubility is reduced. So that tends to be why people become obsessed over desiring a lower pH. We grow crops quite well at high pH as long as we're smart with good placement of fertilizer. Cation exchange capacity is another value again, a general productivity value. It's a measure of soil texture in the organic matter content, measured in milliequivalents per 100 grams. You can estimate it based on the clay content and the organic matter content. Because of that, it's very important for water holding capacity, for nutrient supply and retention. Really what this is, it's a measure of the negative charges in the soil, so it will hold on to the exchangeable cations. Because it's related to texture, it affects herbicide rates. If we have very low cation exchange capacity, it may not be suitable for fall fertilization of high rates of potash. We may have some leaching, and seed place fertilizer is more toxic as we get low cation exchange capacities, basically signaling we're into sandy soils. Some labs and agronomists use cation exchange capacity to estimate or trigger potassium rates based on the base cation saturation ratios. That's a philosophy that is not really been proven to be that useful, certainly not on prairie soils. What it does tend to do, though, is increase their recommended rates of potassium. So it tends to increase the rates and the number of soils that potassium would be recommended on. Now, cation exchange capacity, it's typically overestimated in many of our prairie soils because we're not just measuring cations on those exchange sites, but we measure calcium, magnesium that are in either salts or in free carbonates or free lime in the soil. So this value sometimes is overinflated and not very useful to us. Where it is useful is cation exchange capacity and its relationship to soil texture. So if cation exchange capacity is low, chances are you're on a sandy soil. And as cation exchange capacity increases, you're on a loam soil. When I find that it's over 20% or 20 milliequivalents per 100 grams, then we're getting into loams and clay loams. And typically, many of our heavy clay soils will have a cation exchange capacity near 50 milliequivalents per 100 grams. And why this is important to know the texture. Texture determines the available water content of the soils. And as we get up to clay loams and clay soils, we find that we're able to store for the crop about just over 2.5 inches of available water per foot of soil depth. And that is a measure can directly affect the yield potential of those fields and help you in determining what are suitable yields that I might be fertilizing for. The next part here is that the nutrients that are in the soil test report, they're those that are mobile nutrients. We tend to measure those in a deeper depth, assimilating or representing maybe the rooting zone, and that'd be nitrate, nitrogen, sulfur, and chloride, or the immobile nutrients that don't move very much. There we stick to about the top 6 inches. We typically don't measure the total amount, but we measure an index or availability, which tells us the likelihood of response. It's usually in parts per million. Some labs like to multiply that by 2 to give pounds per acre. I find that confuses agronomists and farmers. Leave the number in parts per million. And that's for phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and most of the micronutrients. And what I'm going to mention here as we go along, what are good soil test values? What's a good working range? Or what's the critical level? That's that level above which there's only a slight chance of yield increase by putting on fertilizer. With nitrate, nitrogen, and of course measured to a 2-foot depth typically, and recommendations are simple on this. You look at what might be the total nitrogen recommended for that crop yield, and then you would simply subtract this value from that amount. There's often variability in nitrate, nitrogen. When its levels are lower than expected, means that maybe the farmer had targeted too low a yield goal and achieved high yields. Nitrogen losses can occur under wet conditions, leaching or denitrification, or we can have low mineralization if we have cool or very dry weather conditions during that year, or simply just low soil organic matter and low reserves. So that may lead to low values in the fall, or we can have high values if the yield goal was set too high, if we had something reduced yield, frost, hail, drought, if we had warm, moist soil conditions and high organic matter, sometimes we could just have a lot of nitrogen released over the course of the year. And as Marla mentioned, if we've got saline areas, we just get a buildup because we have low removal. And we always say here, this is why, because nitrate changes, it can change if we don't handle our soils properly in sampling. So keep them, don't let them stay warm and moist, cool them or dry them and get them tested right away. If we look at some typical values already this fall, AgVise has tested about 10,000 prairie fields, and this is the type of range through the area. Anything unusual here, we often see in southeastern Manitoba. Typically we have higher residual levels simply because there's more manure used in that area. If we're looking at, what's a desirable or a typical amount of a range, we'd say a range of 20 to 60 or 20 to 50 pounds residual nitrogen may be kind of normal. As far, if it's less than that, maybe the crop ran out. Don Flayton and Amy Maget established in their wheat studies that if residual levels were greater than 55 pounds per acre, then a nitrogen supply was greater than that was actually needed for optimum yields. And we see that showing up in other crops too, corn and other cereals, that if we're getting levels greater than 60, it means we probably supplied more nitrogen than we had yield that needed it. With phosphorus, generally for us, the Olsen or sodium bicarbonate test is most appropriate for soils that are neutral to high pH. There are other tests that are also performed. The modified Kelowna used to be done by ALS and Exova labs. A&L Canada Labs runs some other tests also you'll see on the report, but generally they're for use in other areas. The braid tests are done in areas where the soil tends to be acidic, and the P saturation test is required if you're a manure manager in Quebec. But because they do tests from coast to coast, so sometimes you'll see those values reported on their reports. Why soil test P changes? If we're getting lower than normal levels, that's what happens if we've sampled deeper than normal and have more subsoil, or if we have erosion that's caused sampling of subsoil. We can have high removals with forage crops, but in general, long-term depletion is slow. So we can actually go 3 years between tests and still track phosphorus levels. If phosphorus levels seem to be going up, that could be caused by shallow sampling, or something we see, even we saw this last year after the big rains in September. If people went in right away and sampled those waterlogged soils, sometimes we see inflated phosphorus levels. The other thing are high inputs like manure or fertilizer, or if we inadvertently sample fertilizer bands or manure bands. And what's a good number? Well, we go back to the historic studies that were done, almost 100 studies done in the early 60s, and they showed, and we look at what's the probability of response to applied fertilizer. And we find that this we've kind of decided is our sweet spot or our good range, and that's been confirmed with more recent research also. And so we've assigned categories to these levels of phosphorus and general fertilization strategies. If it's testing below this range where we're getting 50% or so response to fertilizer, we look at building phosphorus, meaning our rates should be higher than crop removal. If we're higher than that range, then we can have the flexibility of using phosphorus starter rates only, which are probably less than crop removal. We've kind of selected that the 50% response range is where the sweet spot would be. Areas with higher value or higher yielding crops like Iowa or other areas, they use about a 25% area they target. So they set their critical level higher than ours would be. But we've suggest ours be somewhere in the 10 to 20 part per million range. And when you're there, you just kind of park your phosphorus rates as maintenance, so they equal about what crop removal would be through the rotation. That's where I would be targeting. With potassium, we know potassium, it's held on those exchange sites of clay and organic matter, and it's measured in parts per million in the lab. On our rather young soils, which are loam or clay, heavier soils, they have a high level of potassium. It's part of the clay mineralogy and weathers and releases over time. In spite of having high K levels on many of our soils, there are environmental responses that occur sometimes. So even on a high testing soil, if we have compaction or cool, dry conditions in the spring that reduce the movement of potassium in the soil, we can still sometimes get response to low rates of seed applied potassium, for example, in cereals. But if we look at the research that was done and looking at the number of sites where we had response to potassium, we can say that on very low testing soils, all the sites responded. But if we move down to levels above 100 parts per million potassium, then we're down to about our 20% probability level. And so that tends to be where we would say if we can get over 100 to 125 parts per million of potassium, then we're in a good working range. For some crops like corn and potatoes, our critical level is 200 parts per million. And so we fertilize right up to that level. So it can vary by crop and value of that crop. Sulfur, Marla mentioned this, that it can be highly variable in the landscape. We can have inflated values in those saline areas. And so that's why we advise to stay out of there with your general sampling, although you may do some targeted sampling for just those areas. But it can vary dramatically in the landscape from being excessive in the low areas or deficient on some of those mid slopes. Our critical levels, we like to have over 20 pounds per acre for cereals, or corn. For crops, canola and forages, we need to have a higher level, greater than 30 pounds of sulfur. But again, because of the variability in the test, for some of these crops with high need, like canola forages, we often recommend sulfur regardless of the soil test. And it's quite fine for people to fertilize canola at higher levels than this, because we often find that usually that's the crop in the rotation that receives adequate to extra sulfur, and other crops benefit from that through the rotation. The micronutrients are important to pay attention to. We also need to recognize that different labs can use different extractants. Out here, AgVise and Farmer's Edge tend to use a traditional extractant, DTPA, and so we have established levels whereby if our levels are less than that, we would recommend use of the micronutrient. Note for zinc, it varies by crop. Corn is more sensitive than dry beans, is more sensitive than cereals. And for copper, on mineral soils, it's 0.3, but on peat soils, we need to have a lot higher levels in order to meet the needs of the crop. NL labs, they tend to use some different extractants, and note that the critical levels are quite a bit higher. So you need to make sure that you're using ANL criteria with the ANL report. Other factors are important in assessing the likelihood of a deficiency, like the soil texture, the organic matter, and the pH also enter into your micronutrient decision. And the next part of this would be moving into fertilizer recommendations. And you can get second opinions from our fertility guide and some of our updated guidelines, but soil test reports generally print recommendations. I hope that your local fertilizer dealer or your consultants have some local or regionalized advice to offer on those, and certainly consider removal values, particularly if your yields are a lot higher, and particularly if you're managing phosphorus in a range. And I'm going to conclude with this, Lionel, just that we're available for soil interpretation consults. I used to do a lot of this in Ontario with 5 to 10 participants. We'd call them kitchen meetings or shop meetings. Today, with restrictions on meetings, we may just have to go back to these very small meetings where farmers would bring in their own soil test reports and we'd discuss them. Marla and I often put on our 2-day soil fertility workshops, 3 or 4 a year. If we have to this next year, we may do these as webinars, but stay tuned on whether we roll that out. So Lionel, I'll end with that and queue up your panel if there's not any questions.
Okay, thanks, John. One question that did come through, and I'm trying to figure it out. But anyways, it's regarding the herbicide rates, and you mentioned that some results are would affect. Would that be more on the texture of the soil? Is that what you were getting at? That would affect the herbicide, how well the herbicide works?
Yeah, good. It is a good question, and it's an underutilized on the soil test. But you're going to be better than this than me. But I believe Treflan and Edge are products that do vary rates based on, and I'm not sure, is it on the soil texture or is it on the organic matter? It may be texture. There's some other soil applied herbicides too that may be affected by either of those. And so as you check the label, and they'll often show a range of rates, just check to see whether it's indicating that organic matter or texture. Generally, the higher the organic matter or the heavier the texture, the more clay, those rates tend to increase.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to say, that usually more organic matter, usually more clay or clay loam soil, and lighter soils like sandy soils, usually less organic matter. Is that kind of a rule of thumb?
Yes.
Good. Well, thanks, John and Marla. That was a good presentation. I think there's a lot of information there. So I know the good part about it is these are recorded. So now for producers to our consultants to sit down with the report and go through it and just kind of use your slides to go through it line by line, I think would be a good thing to do. So thanks again for putting
Lionel, I'd rather they invite me out to meet with a couple of their growers and we can do that. So
okay, we did get a few questions coming in here, so just hold on a second. Okay, while you're out sampling, would you recommend taking a clubroot spore test as well? I think I don't think Dane is on the line today, but David Kaminsky, are you on and available to answer that one?
I'm on. I'm not sure that I can give a definitive answer. There are, of course, different techniques for taking an appropriate sample for clubroot spores. It's much more of a surface sample than a core taken down to depth. So if you want details on that, I suggest that you contact Dane directly.
And,
okay.
and Dave, I also believe that for clubroot, they try to target specific or high risk areas of the field, like entrances. And that would be a little different than the sampling pattern for to characterize the whole field.
Yeah, I agree with
right, John. I want to chime in again. And besides field entrances where there is compaction, other places to look are low spots where water sits for a little longer than elsewhere in the field. And if you have in the past noticed an area of the field where the crop is traditionally looking funny, stunted, that sort of thing, then those are areas to mark and zero in on in the fall or in the spring.
Okay, good comments, guys. And I'll maybe just add to that if the procedure for taking the sample is different, like David mentioned, but if you're out in the field and you do notice something different, I think it would be an opportunity to grab a sample if you have do the right criteria for grabbing the sample. So good comments, guys. Thanks.
Lionel, one more chime in here, and that's that those samples go to PSI, which is an arm's length from government laboratory, and canola growers who are members of Manitoba Canola Growers Association can get at least one test each year done for free. There is a larger fee for subsequent samples, I believe.
Okay, good. Thanks, Dave. Next question, John. Could you comment on fertilizing alfalfa hay fields in the fall versus the spring?
Well, yes, if you're going to fertilize in the fall, have it done by now. We like to do that like right after second cut or something, while there's little regrowth and there's maximum time for some of that fertilizer to do some good. Have some water to wash it in. If you're on sandier soils, you want that potassium in the soil, into the roots and into the plant, because it acts as antifreeze for winter survival. So I'd be thinking at this time it's a little late to get your P&K on, but maybe better late than never, and because you'd really like it on a little earlier, so it's doing some good for you. The bad that fertilizing forages does is we hate it when we get runoff and that stuff gets in the lakes and rivers, and we don't want to see the livestock guys being painted as the bad actors in this. So get your P&K on at a different time of year or earlier. After first cut's a perfect time, the soil is dry, there's lots of spreaders available, and you can do a good job then. I'm not really angry, but I just want to see that people get it on at the right time at less risk to the environment.
Good. Okay, thanks, John. What is the most common and best phosphate test for Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta?
I'm biased, and the one that's pretty universal is the Olsen bicarbonate test, because we actually have recommendations to go with it. As you move further west, they have more acidic soils, and that's why they've been hip on using the modified Kelowna test in the past, and it's worked well for them, and it's the one that they actually, I think, still use in Alberta and are calibrated for it. So I can live with that. But in Manitoba and areas where we tend to have neutral to higher pH, it's the Olsen or sodium bicarb's the one.
Okay. What is the deadline for fall fertilizer application?
I think it's the stroke of midnight on November 10th.
Okay. And just a comment on the club route. This year, all tests are free for Manitoba canola grower members, free blackleg club route and glyphosate kochia testing, and also club route testing for crops going into canola next year is recommended to accurately assess spore loads. So I guess when you're doing soil sampling, if you have a spot, if you can get it tested, then especially if in areas where wheat fields, I guess, or any other fields, I guess you say, that are targeted for canola next year. So thanks for those comments. Okay, Lori, if you could turn the screen to me, and we'll get into our producer panel. And again, there's the panel, and now there's the email addresses for Lori and myself to get questions to us. So if you have them, please forward them to us. First one's to John, and this one maybe not as critical, but it was asked a couple times what this worm was. We're seeing in a lot of fields right now at this time of year. So John Gawlowski, can you let us know what this guy is?
Yeah, so there's a group of hairy caterpillars known as woolly bears, and this particular one is called the banded woolly bear. It will eventually become a moth called the Isabella tiger moth. They're not considered pests of any crops in any way. They've got a very general feeding habit. They'll feed on lots of different species of plants, and they're an insect that's very well adapted to cold weather. Being hairy like this, they're found even up into the Arctic. It's an insect that can actually freeze solid and still survive. They produce something called a bioprotectant in their insect blood, and it helps keep them alive even if they freeze solid. So they will overwinter as a caterpillar. You'll see them, they're one of the last caterpillars we see in the season. You'll see them crawling around right until it's almost freezing out, and they'll just crawl under some debris to overwinter. You'll see them again in early spring, but again, they're not considered a crop pest. They've got a very general feeding habit and more of an interesting curiosity than anything you need to worry about.
Hey, John. It's John Hurt here. Is it true that if you see them crawling south, it's going to be a cold winter?
Okay, there's a lot of folklore about this insect. There's a couple things. No is the short answer to your question, John. And the other myth about this caterpillar, some people believe that the more black on it and the shorter the brown band, the harsher the winter will be. And that's a myth as well. That brown band just gets bigger and bigger as they molt and as they get to be bigger caterpillars. But again, there's a lot of mythology about this insect, to the point where there are actually several festivals for woolly bears in the fall, and people will try to predict the weather at these festivals. So next time you're in Lions Head, Ontario in the fall, check out their Woolly Bear Weekend. It's one of several woolly bear festivals that happen in the fall, with a little bit of weather prediction tossed in.
Okay, and a comment just came in as to why do you always see them crossing the road?
Well, this time of year, they're moving around basically, either looking for lusher food to feed on or an area to overwinter. So they're very active this time of year. And yeah, you will often see them crossing country roads and even some major highways. Highway 3 south of Carmen, when I go for my noontime bike rides, I often see them crossing the road. And it's just because they're active, they're looking for fresh food and overwintering sites. Okay,
thanks, John. Next question to Dave Kaminsky. I was talking with a producer the other day, and he's wondering, all of a sudden he's hearing more and more about verticillium wilt and canola. He said that in the past years it's been sclerotinia, blackleg, and then clubroot. So he's saying, where did it come from? And also some questions regarding if the fungicides that we're using for sclerotinia will help control it. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dave, and he's got I think we have to let him use his screen. So go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I'm not sure I need to use my screen, but I'll talk to the participants directly here. The first short answer is the inquirer is growing canola too often in that particular field. That'd be my assessment. If you say that in the past you've had a problem with sclerotinia and blackleg, and now you've got clubroot as well, where did verticillium come from? Well, it's almost a ubiquitous pathogen. It is out there and it is everywhere. You can't say it came with the seed or anything like that. A few years back, Agriculture Canada had some, I don't know, trade issues where they said, we've got this verticillium organism in the prairie region and we're not taking your canola as a result. So right away there was panic, and they did an investigation to determine whether this should be a quarantine pest, which they would try to eradicate, or a named pest, which they would try and regulate. In the end, based on an intensive survey done by Agriculture Canada, CFIA actually. They determined that it was everywhere already, and it was apparently not causing a yield loss concern. There's that observation that those symptoms appear late in the season, and some dispute about whether or not they can cause lodging of the canola crop. I've got some examples to show you, and I'll begin just by holding up a sample to the camera. And this is something that I collected this year from a field. I collected maybe...
David, we can't, or I can't see your camera right now.
You can't see my camera.
No, I've got it. It's okay. It's there. It must just be your view, Lionel.
Okay.
Okay, so in the field where I pulled 100 plants, there were quite a few symptoms of verticillium. One of the things is shredding along the stem. You see that? And that might be a red herring because lots of people know that sclerotinia also causes shredding of the stem, the epidermis essentially. The next thing you might notice is that grayish appearance, and this might be confused with things like gray stem, or what we used to call the avirulent or weakly virulent type of blackleg. Today it's known as Leptosphaeria biglobosa or biglobosa, and it's related to L. maculans, the cause of virulent blackleg, but it is not an issue. It appears late in the season, and it has no significant impact on yield. And that is probably the same with gray stem. There's been a lot of interest across the prairies about this disease, this organism, and really the research community has an assignment to determine the real impact of the disease. There's lots of research questions to be answered about it, and I think all I can say is that it's on our radar, and we're ready to look at it. Okay, I noticed my webcam clicked off. Are there any questions before I go any further?
I guess just one comment, and the comment was that CFIA has officially changed the name to verticillium stripe because it's more of a stem striping disease than a wilting disease.
I'm glad you brought that point up, Lionel, because in the countries where it is known and common, here I talk about Europe, particularly the Scandinavian countries where they grow winter canola. Yes, it has caused a wilt, same organism, known as Verticillium longisporum. There is also Verticillium alboatrum and Verticillium dalei from potatoes. Longisporum can cause both a wilt, but so far I don't think we have seen it in Manitoba, at least. I don't know about the rest of the prairies because I haven't been out to those fields. But here it seems to be causing just this outer symptom, and that's not a wilt. So yes, the Canola Council of Canada wants to emphasize that we need to be clear in our messaging by only referring to it right now in Canada as verticillium stripe. So that maybe explains that difference. Some of the fine details, and I don't know if I can show this again, are when you open the stem, you'll find, okay, show my screen. And maybe just show my video. Okay. You open the stem, you look inside, and you see it also is gray. However, if you look really closely with a hand lens or something like that, or take a picture of it with your camera and blow it up, you'll find what the black inside are microsclerotia. And those microsclerotia are how the pathogen survives in the field, and possibly how they spread to other fields, because some of this chaff will end up in your harvested canola or blow to neighboring fields. It's easy to see how it can get around.
Okay, well, thanks, David. That was a good answer to, I guess, not a new disease, but a disease we're talking more about anyway. So, okay, we'll go to the next question. And if you could give me the screen back, Lori, great. This one would be for Ann or John, I guess. Was talking to a producer a couple days ago, and he's planning for next year, and he says he's been having real problems trying to get over the past 3 years trying to get high protein. He's changed varieties, he's increased his fertilizer, he says he's averaging around 70 bushels an acre. Is nitrogen the only thing that he should be looking at, or are there other nutrients that affect protein development?
Sure, I think I'll just maybe give a comment, and then hopefully John can add some more information. But yeah, there are other nutrients that do impact protein development, so like sulfur and potassium would as well. Nitrogen is obviously the main nutrient that we're looking for. And yeah, so nitrogen would probably be the one to focus on, unless this farmer has any deficiencies with any other nutrients, because obviously having, you know, a well-rounded soil is important. John, do you want to give any comments about when that nitrogen should be applied for prime protein development?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because people always think about its rate of nitrogen, but it's not just rate, it's placement and timing. You know, if anyone is applying liquid nitrogen at this point, thinking it's going to be there for next year's wheat crop, good luck with that. Like there are the right ways and wrong ways to put the products on. So we have some in-season applications that have been studied, and they can help increase the protein. And if we put it on at the jointing stage or stem elongation, can still have some yield impact too. So we can use some of the other things besides rate to impact protein. Sometimes even some of the different fertilizer sources have been shown in some studies to aid protein. As far as the sulfur, that was well studied some 20 years ago, and we know that sulfur is important for protein quality, but across the board, it was not, sulfur did not impact the protein amount or the amount that was measured at the elevator, and that's how the farmer gets paid. So although fertilizing with sulfur can sometimes increase the gluten strength and some of the other good baking qualities, it is not something that farmers are rewarded for when they develop their when they deliver their wheat to the elevator. So it's something that's nice for them to do, but they ain't going to get paid for it.
Okay, so basically timing, I think, is probably one of his next steps then.
As long as he's already supplying at least between 2 to 2.5 pounds of nitrogen per bushel that he's getting. Like that's the base. And then after that, he can look at some of the timing things if he's still struggling to get protein.
Great. Okay, thanks, guys. John Hurd, John Gavlowski, sorry. This photo was taken by one of the extension specialists, Nicole Clausen, and I thought maybe if you would address this as to what's there and what kind of damage are they doing.
Yeah, so often when you pull up canola roots late in the season, you'll see these. So this is the pupa case of a root maggot, and we've actually got at least four species of root maggots in Manitoba. The common one's the cabbage maggot, and They're root feeders. They lay their eggs usually right at soil level or even sometimes just below, and the larva will get into the roots and make tunnels and feed. It often gets unnoticed unless you have a very dry year associated with it. Then you might start to see wilting plants and plants that just aren't growing well. So they can be an economic issue, but there's really nothing you can do about root maggots. Aside from good crop rotation, there's no insecticides that are registered. Nothing really would work well. And so they will overwinter as a pupa in the soil, or if there's roots left right next to the roots, and come out as a fly sometime in the late spring.
Okay, thanks, John. That's an example of some of the stuff that John and David put together for their disease and insect reports on our website. So just another good example of another place to get some real good information. So thanks again, you guys. That's it for the questions for the panel today. I've got a few slides to go through just to end the day. The first one is environmental farm plans. Haven't talked about them a lot this year, and they are still ongoing. Workshops are available. So if you have producers or a producer that's looking at wanting to update your environmental farm plan or take it for the first time, I guess due to the COVID, where they're doing them virtually, and there's a list of the meetings that are going to be happening right up till the end of the year, and there'll also be meetings happening in the new year. And Tammy Watson, there's her information, her phone number, and her email contact. So if you're interested in attending one of them, that's the person to get a hold of. The seasonal crop reports, and I mentioned the crop report and the insect and disease updates that already today. Our hay listing is still up and going, so there are areas that are looking for hay, and if you have hay for sale, the best way to get your information on is to contact your local office or the toll-free number, which is listed there. And there's the website address for the hay listing. Crop residue burning, as we're getting more into the fall, we're starting to see a few more fires out there, so definitely check the authorization to see if you're allowed to burn in your area on the day you're looking at burning. There is the contact information for the farm production extension specialists in the province. So again, as always, feel free to contact these people. They're there to help you solve your questions and definitely give you the information you require. And I guess join us next week, October the 7th for our next edition of Crop Talk. Thanks for attending.
Lionel,